So we've taken our truck all apart and we've done some miscellaneous repairs. Now we have to assemble it all, get our lines looking all nice and tight, just like you see them in those show quality pictures you want to get your truck to look like. My name's David Welch. I'm at Brothers Tech Center every single week, making sure your truck gets back on the road and looks good too. Today, I'm going to show you how to assemble your front sheet metal, get everything lined up, how to take care of any problems you might be running into along the way so you can get a show quality truck yourself. Now I'm going to start this video assuming that the frame is already straight, because just straightening out a frame is a video in of itself. So we're just talking about sheet metal today. So after I made sure my frame is straight, I'm going to make sure that it is level, front to back, side to side. I'll get a level and I'll double check all that. I'm also going to make sure that I've got new cab mounts front and rear, because we can't be using the old ones that might be sagging unevenly and expect to get everything to line up. I'm not going to use a level right here, and I can double check things. If I know my frame is straight, when I put this on my running board down here, that bubble should look straight. When I put it up here on the drip rail, it should look straight. When I put it back here on the window, when I put it right here, it should look straight. Now you can't absolutely take that as gospel, because you could have dents and all kinds of weird things going on. So I'm not using it as gospel, but I'm using it as a good rule of thumb on if I'm lined up or not. So the first thing we got to make sure when we're doing our front sheet metal is our cab lined up, because if it's off, everything else is off. Let me show you how we do that. Now, in order to make sure that I've got my cab straight, I'm going to do a lot of different measurements. One of the measurements I'm going to be doing is an X measurement right here to make sure that I'm nice and even. So I can take this and put it into my radiator core support, which look like they're nice and even and not damaged. And I can use this bolt hole right here for the cowl to see if I'm lining up good. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll put a bolt in there. It makes it easier to get the tape measure on there if I'm going to be measuring the opposite direction, like this right here. And sometimes I'll leave it out. It just depends on whatever's easier for measuring. So if I was to measure this, for instance, right now I'm getting basically just a little bit under 66 and a half. So let's see what the other side looks like. Okay, and here we've got just a little bit over. So all I'm going to do is see if this will move forward a little bit. Of course, I don't have my cab mounts completely tightened up yet. And then I'll shove that side one way and this the other. Double check my measurements here. And this is probably one of the most common mistakes that people will do when they are putting this together. If this is catty corner on you, if this is shifted like this, then when you put your front fenders on, one's going to look too long and the other's going to look too short. So having the cab straight is going to be your first plan of attack. Okay, so now we're looking perfectly even on either side. Sometimes I'll do other measurements too, but basically you want to use something that's going to match on the right and the left. You could use where the inner fender bolts on right here. You could put a bolt in it, and then you could measure from your bolt hole there to your radiator core support mount. Different things like that. You could measure on the back. Whatever you got to do to make sure that you're even. And you could have had an accident. Maybe this got smashed in, so that you know that if you were to use this measurement, it's not going to be as accurate as using this measurement up here. You're going to have to decide those things when you're working on it and see what works out the best for your lineup. Now that my cab is all set up, let's get some sheet metal and start putting it on. So I'm going to go ahead and bolt down the cab and make sure that it's not going to move on me before I put anything on. That's important. The first thing I am going to put on is the door. So what I'll do is I'll put the hinges on the door first. If you put the hinges on the cab and then try to mount the door up, you're kind of like balancing everything in the air, and it's more difficult to do. But you can just simply take your door and you can put some rags down here on the bottom to assimilate about 3/16 of an inch or so, and then you just simply bolt the hinges on the door, and you can just take your door and put it right up here like this. Now when you're installing these, everything's nice and controlled, and it's a lot easier to get these started. When you're using these bolts right here, make sure you're checking your threads. These are fine threads, so they strip out really easy, and it is extremely difficult to get to the nut, if you will, that's behind here. There's a caged nut that has all three of these bolt holes in them, and if you strip it out, it is just a bear to replace. So you always want to make sure that you check all your threads and make sure you don't have any rust or anything that's going to mess those up. Another thing you might want to do before you do this, which I've already done, is chase out the threads and make sure you knock out any paint, dirt, rust, or anything you've got in there. All right, so here's a little trick I like to do. I'll take a piece of cardboard and I'll just fold it over like this. I'll put it right on top of the rocker panel, and then I'll just put the door right on top of that. And that's giving me a nice firm, even all the way across the bottom down here. You can see my line is nice and even here, and then my line's pretty even up at the top. So once I get this basically where I want it, I'll go ahead and tighten it up. Now, the doors is your first place to start, because the doors, where they sit in, is stationary, if you will. So you're not going to really move the cab here and all this, the B pillar or anything like that. But all of this other sheet metal, you can move it around a lot. So we have to get the doors in the right spot first in order to be able to see where we're going to do other sheet metal. So I want you to notice a couple of different things on how these doors adjust. Right here, if we loosen this up, we can go up or down. We can go back and forth a little bit. And so we'll get it set up in here. Basically, I'll be watching my lines here, my line here, to make sure that they're even. I don't want a big gap on this side and a skinny gap on that side. I don't want a skinny gap here and a giant gap there. We want to be pretty much even all the way around. Another thing I want you to notice on how this door aligns is that, and why it's so important that you got to get this right before you get your sheet metal on the front. Now, even if you get the doors right, you still might have to put your sheet metal on and take it back off again, because you can only get to these bolts when your front fender is off. Now, when these bolts right here, they're loosened up, I can take the door and I can move it out, or I can move it in. Now, when I'm moving this corner out or in, what's happening at the opposite end of the corner, if you will, it's also moving out or in. So if I was to take this, and that won't move. If I move that all the way out, you can see I've got a giant gap right here, and it takes this corner and it tucks that corner in. If I take this and push it in, now I've got a nice gap right here. My corner comes out, and we're lining up nice and even. Now, it won't always happen that way. Sometimes you might have to add some extra metal here. Maybe this was in an accident and it's pushed in. You're going to have to bring it out, the door, etc., etc. So you want to get your overall alignment set up. And then if you've got anything odd like this door tucking out or in, then you'll know, is it the door, is it the cab, what have you. So get all your lineups pretty nice first, and then we'll see what we got to do from there. So give me just a minute or so here to make sure I like where this door is, and then I'll show you, you guessed it, what comes next. I've got my door on right where I basically like it. It's not perfect. Let's take a look at a few things that we might want to change. Right here, wherever you've got multiple bends all collapsing in at the same time, that'll generally make the metal pop out a little bit, if you will. So that right here you can see that we've got a really tight point on this. And what we're going to have to decide is, are we going to cut the cab and move it back, or are we going to shave off a little on the door? So we're going to have to make sure that we get our lines on that. How we do that is we use straight edges, and we bring it down here, and we see if it looks like it's coming off the edge or something like that. So if I'm bringing this down and I've got this right on here, I can see that this is bumped out just a little bit. If I do the same thing on this, this is looking pretty straight. So in this case, I'll more than likely take it off on the door. Now on your edges, you gotta be, you gotta be careful, because there's just a little bit of the flat metal that's bending over there. So when you grind this off, you're gonna have to get the welder and then weld this back on. If you grind too much off, the metal will split. So be careful on that. Now, taking the line and coming on down, right here it's looking like it's getting pretty tight, and that'd be a reasonable thing, because we've done some repairs down here. I forget if I think this got hit in the back also. So what I would do on something like this is I would do what I call splitting the seam. And what you would do is you would simply move back from the edge about a quarter of an inch or so, and then you would simply determine the area that you need to widen, or sometimes you might need to narrow that gap too. And you would just simply slice down, and then you would move this to either position, either in or out, depending on what you need, and then weld it back up. But don't do any cutting and welding until you get everything lined up. You might think that this door's right, but you get everything all lined up and you can see, oh, okay, this is off a little bit here or there. Another example is right here on the running board down here. Now, technically speaking, the edge of this door and this running board right here, that should line up. So technically speaking, this door should be about right here or so. But when I did the rocker panel, maybe I got it a hair off, maybe the door's just a little bit too far back. There's a couple of different things. So we don't start slicing and dicing until we get everything all set up, and then we'll take a look at what we might want to cut or not. So I'm going to get that other door on there, and then we'll start putting on some fenders, huh? All right, so I got this door on, and when I put it on and adjusted it, I like the way it looked. I put the other door back on, I came back to this one, and you're able to see things you just didn't quite see with a little bit of time away. One of the things I like to use is a stir stick, because it's a nice consistent, usually about, 3/16 of an inch or so. And the nice thing is that you can put it in here. It's a little difficult sometimes to look at either side and be able to tell like 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. Those are the lines we're fighting for. But here we can see we've got a lot more gap than we've got right here. And when I'm running it down the back side, it is just really too tight. So I'm going to go ahead and move this forward. Now when I do that, I want to just do one hinge at a time. If I loosen up both hinges, then the door's going to drop down, and I've got it at the height that I like it, because this line right here and this line right here is lining up really nice. Now this doesn't always work. Sometimes when you loosen up one, it'll come back down anyway, but at least this will make it a little bit easier for you, hopefully. So we'll get our stir stick. Okay, so that's feeling better. I can actually leave the stick there while I'm doing this. And when you're lining up your doors, you don't want to have your door regulator or striker in, because it's going to force the back side of the door wherever that latch puts it. So we always have them off, so we've got plenty of free room here. Now I can loosen up the bottom. It'll more than likely just automatically slide forward, but not necessarily. Alright, that's getting a little bit better. Now sometimes you'll put on a door and it'll just fall right into the same spot. Take you 15-20 minutes to put on. Other times you'll put on a door and it'll take you 2 hours or more to get in the right spot. So just know that and accept that fact. You might have to pull the door on and off several times. And that goes for your fenders and everything else too. It's going to be time consuming, but you can handle it. All right, so everything's lining up really nice now. Now, it's not perfect. I'm still going to have to take care of a few little idiosyncrasies here. Like a lot of times, this gap right here is a little bit wider. I can see that this gap right here is a bit wide, but if I put my stir stick in here, it is fitting just perfect. Now I'm going to have to do some cutting and welding techniques on those to get them in that perfect position. I'm going to show you that a little bit later in the video because you're going to want to get everything lined up as perfect as possible before you start doing any slicing and dicing. Next are fenders. Now, in order to put my front fenders on, I'm going to want to bolt them to something in the front here. So I'm just going to put on my front core support right here. Of course, I've got brand new bushings in the perches and everything like that. And I've got a level on here because I don't know if you noticed it or not, but that front end's a little damaged and it might take a shim or two on one side or the other to get things to level out. It looks like we're doing pretty good in that situation. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is make sure that this is squared up with the cab. We're going to do it same way we did the cab. We'll take miscellaneous measurements from different places. We'll go with a cross measurement on both sides here. I'll take some measurements from here. And you got to kind of take your measurements with a bit of a grain of salt because there could have been accidents and miscellaneous things like that over the years. So you kind of use the average of all of that math in order to get this as straight as possible. Once I've got it where I want it, I'll tighten it up some, but I'm not going to get crazy tight with it because when I bolt my fenders on, I'll probably have to move this around a little bit and get some more shifting in there and get it in the right spot. So now let's see how well our fenders line up. So first I'll just put the fender up without any shims on or anything like that. I'm just getting it up to get it up. And once I get it on, I'll take a look at it and I'll determine what kind of shims I might need. I got a little bit of a trick for that, so I'll show you that in just a second as soon as I get this all on here. Make sure you keep a good hold of it. You don't want that front end to drop down on you. And I'm not putting every single bolt on. Another thing you might notice is that I don't have my inner fenders in here right now, and the reason is that I'm just doing the outline lines to make sure they're all nice and tight. Sometimes when you put your inner fenders on, they fight with you and stuff like that. Now you will have to put your inner fenders on for your final alignment, but when I'm just doing this basic stuff here and getting the rough cut done, I leave them out. Makes it a little bit easier. So I've got my fender on, and right off the bat I can tell that it's a little bit off. One of the things is that there's too much of a gap that is at the top, and down at the bottom it's too tight. And I want my fender to just fit on there nice and comfortable. It shouldn't have to be torqued up or down or anything like that in order to get it into line. If it doesn't fit naturally, you don't have it done right. And in this case, what's happening is that radiator core support, because of the damage that was done to the frame in the past, it's drooped down a little bit. We're going to add some extra shims in there, bring it up, and that's going to take our fender and bring it up also and make it fit more comfortable, get this gap to go for us better. Now, another thing I want you to see, which you may not be able to see on the camera really, I'm not sure, but the fender is tucked in too far. So what you do is you just get some fender spacers here and you just set one up there and you see if it looks even after that case or not. Now you might have to get a big fat one like this and then put a little skinny one on there too in order to get it to fit right. So here I got a fat one and a little bit skinnier one. In order to make it easier to handle and work with, I just get a little bit of tape and put it on there like this. And the reason that I like to do that is that when I'm sliding it back here, it's generally difficult to hold on to several different shims and keep them all balanced. They can fall down quite commonly and stuff. So you just put a little bit of tape on there. You'll just go ahead and just slip that right on in there and then tighten it up and double check our lines here and see how it looks. So give me a few minutes to see if I can get all that stuff nice and perfect, and we'll see what comes next. So what I've done is I've taken the bolt out of the front of the fender, and I'm going to get this line nice and tight. I need to have this be able to move so that I can get this line good, and then I'll be able to see how much to take the radiator core support up or not. But if that's left bolted on, it's going to fight me and drag me down and make this job more difficult. So let me get this line perfect, then we'll work that out. I've got my gap nice and proper right in the back. Now I can see what's going on in the front. At first glance, it looks like it lines up, but the fender's not bolted in at all. If this were to sit like this, now we can see that it is really off right there. So I'm going to use 2 of these shims here in addition to what I've got there, and then that will take up the space that I've got there. So if you're fighting anything, stop and make sure that everything's shimmed up correctly, because everything should fit nice and comfortable like. So now we got our gap right here nice, and what we can do now is put the straight edge up against the fender and the door right here, and we can see if the door is folded out too much, if the fender's tucked in too much. The fender does normally tuck in, and the door does also normally do a bit of a tuck in like that, but you want to make sure that your overall is nice and even. And if you're going for a higher quality truck where you're kind of getting rid of those rounded edges and you're making it nice and straight, then you're going to have to just work the metal until it gets done. So at this particular point in time, depending on what level you're doing, you're going to be pulling off your fender and go ahead and rolling out this edge, taking this here and rolling it in. Another thing that happened is you can see right here there's a nice big dent that used to be in here. I got a really good video on YouTube for you on how I repaired this. If you go and subscribe to our channel, it's going to be a lot easier to find this, but this was really crushed in and we took out the dent all the way. But when that happens, a lot of times what's going to happen to your edge right here is it's either going to take it and suck it in too much, or it might push it out, and that's exactly what's happening with this door right here. So one of the things that's going to happen on this door is that I'll need to grind this edge down and weld it back on up. I'll show you what that looks like in just a bit. All right, so let's do a quick little recap. We made sure that our frame was straight. We put our cab on with new cab mounts. We made sure the cab was straight. We went ahead and bolted our hinges onto the door. Then we bolted the door onto the cab. We got it nice and straight. Working forward, we're getting our front fender line good straight. And then we go ahead and we get our core support to line up with our front fender. Now I'm going to go ahead and go over everything again and double check it, make sure I like everything. Then I'll go ahead and I'll put on my cowl and my hood, and we'll see how that's lining up. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but I really like these assembly bolts here. Whenever I'm going to do one of these, I go ahead and I order these assembly bolts. And the kick to these is, as you see this point right here, and the threads go all the way up to the point. So what happens is when you've got sheet metal that's not quite lining up, you can go ahead and get this in there, and when it screws in, it's actually lining up your sheet metal and everything at the same time. This is a lot easier way to go. Now you can strip your bolts if you get a little bit kicky-catty on it, so you got to make sure you're going in nice and straight. A good thing to do is to go ahead and trace through all of the holes first. Make sure you're not having any problems, because once you put your piece of metal up there and you're trying to line up everything and get it to look good, you don't know, is it the threads that are messed up, the nut that's welded inside, or just the sheet metal not lining up. All right, now this particular year of truck, this is 62, but it's basically all the same from 60 to 66, and 67, 72, etc. doesn't have this cowl right here. But at any rate, when I'm lining this up, I go ahead and put this piece on first and have it go all the way back. There's not a lot of movement for this piece right here. It basically goes in one spot, although it can move a little, so you have to be aware of that. Now I'm going to make sure my gap on the bottom is good. I'll just put a stir stick and have it hold it for me. And just lightly tighten these down here. Then I will want to make sure my gap's here. It's obviously pretty wide. Now here at the top it's getting tight. Here at the bottom it's tight, but here you can see we got a pretty wide gap. That's more than likely because of this damage right here, and the whole thing shrunk back. So we'll have to fix that later. Up here, we'll just go ahead and spread this out a little bit. Now sometimes these will take shims in order to go up or down or in and out for these right here. Occasionally this one too, but this one doesn't look like it's going to need it for whatever reason. So I'll tighten these down, I'll get my other side, then I'll have it basically where I need for my hood to go on. I'll put it on and just see how it's looking. Now, it seems a little unusual I'm going to be putting the hood on because on the 60 to 66, you need your inner fenders in to be able to bolt on your hood hinges. But what I'm doing here is just a rough cut. I'm looking for big, ugly things that are off. I'm just setting the hood on here to see if there's anything that's wildly out that I'm going to have to take care of. I have to have the inner fenders out when I'm doing all my fine tuning on my front fenders and my door lineup, because if my inner fender is in there, a lot of times it will create pressures and push things forward or aft or out of place. And I need to know, is it the fender not fitting comfortably, or is it just the inner fender that's giving me interference? So after I get all my lines on my sheet metal perfect, then I can put in my inner fenders. If it's fighting me, I will modify my inner fenders, not my cab or my fenders that I know are in the right spot. So let's get our hood on and see if there's anything radically off. So my hood is fitting on pretty nice, but 60 to 66 hoods are probably the easiest hood to line up on a truck, with the exception of this right here. Now, whenever you put on your hood, if you do not have the rubber that goes underneath here, it is more than likely going to tuck down. So I can see that this is off, but because the rubber's not in there, I know why that's that. So I've got everything looking pretty nice. I'm going to go ahead and take my hood off. I'm going to go ahead and show you some more advanced techniques on lineup, and we're going to get this thing perfect. Now, the first advanced technique I'm going to show you is what I call splitting the seam. And basically what's going to happen is, because we've got this really wide gap right here, tight at the top, kind of tight at the bottom, but we got this here, and that's relatively common right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just cut the metal right here, and we're going to cut it about 1/4 of an inch or so back from the edge. Now, the problem with cutting it right on the edge is that if you were to move it forward and get it where you want it, and then you weld it up, a lot of times what happens is the heat shrink pulls it all the way back. Plus, then you're going to have to try to get and sand this radius of this edge right here perfect. But if you cut it 1/4 inch back and then move it forward, this edge will look all original, and you can just go ahead and weld up on the edge. Nobody will know anything better. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this up and show you little things on that. So in order to keep my lines that I'm going to be cutting nice and straight, there's a couple of different tricks. If the area that I'm going to be cutting is nice and straight, I can use a piece of tape on it like that. And now I know my line's going to be nice and even, not going to jagged on me. But when you get a curved piece like this right here up in the corner, it's not as easy. So what you want to do for something like that is you just get something to hold up against the edge, put your pen like that, and then you can just go right on down like that, and that'll keep it nice and even. So that's what I did right here. And now I've got that. I'll go ahead and slice this up. Now, you might have to move this forward, you might have to move this back, but whatever case may be, if it's not lining up with your door and your door is correct, then you're going to need to move your cab. Now remember, in the front right here, it's the door that we know is off, and we're going to have to fix it and not the cowl. So be sure when you start slicing and dicing, you're slicing and dicing the right thing. Now, I'm just using a regular old electric die grinder. I get the thinnest wheels that I can get because I don't want to cut out a giant gouge in there. And when I'm cutting out, I want to make sure that I don't take my wheel and bury it into my metal, because there could be supports and wires and gas lines and everything behind there. So when I'm putting this in, I'm only going the depth of the metal, and that's it. So now I'm just going to go ahead and grind the paint away, because when you're welding, of course, paint, rust, and dirt is not conducive to a good weld. Now, in order to spread this out, you can take your screwdriver and then just twist it gently. Sometimes, though, that'll take the metal and it will contort it a little bit. So sometimes what's a good idea to do is something like this. And I'm just trying to gently bring this forward. I don't want to get too aggressive with it, take it too far. Okay. So now I've got a nice gap right here. When I'm using the stir stick, I'm not looking for a really tight where I can't get it in or I have to drag it difficult. I want to have it go up and down with relative ease and not get snagged on anything. Because what I'll do when I'm doing my body work is I'll actually use the same stir stick and actually put sandpaper on it and then use it to sand my lines so that they're even more perfect. But that's a video for another day. So this is ready to weld up now. Before I do that, I want to make sure that my edges of my metal are lining up and I didn't accidentally tweak them off a little bit. So I'll fix those and make sure that they are even first. And when I'm welding this up, what you got to remember is that heat is your nemesis. It's going to cause you more problems than anything else. If I was just to start a weld right here and weld all the way down, all the immense heat would just take all of this and just shrink it all back. It'd probably warp your metal and everything else. And another thing that's going to happen is if I start welding at the top, by the time I get down here a ways, this gap right here is just going to shrink up on me. So what I have to do is I have to maintain this gap from top to bottom and keep my temperature down. So what we're going to do for that is I'll get some tack welds here in the middle where it's the fattest and the widest, because right here it's pretty secure at the top and the bottom. So I'll get some tack welds in here so that we know this isn't going to shrink in, and then I'm only going to do small tack welds, 1, 2, maybe 3 tack welds at a best. Then I'll let it cool down some. I'll go ahead and I'll grind them off a little bit, weld some, cool some, grind some. You don't want to weld it all and then grind it all because it makes more work for you. It builds up more heat. If you just do a few tack welds and then grind down, it keeps all your welding area clean. It makes it easier to see if everything's lined up. So let's do that and see what it looks like. Now when you get a big gap like that, you can't just grab your gun and hit the button and weld, because it'll more than likely burn on through. So what you're going to do is you're just going to hit your welder real quick like that, and you're just going to get a little BB built up. And then you, if you need to, you just build up that BB, get a little bit bigger, get a little bit bigger. Then you can hit it with a little bit more power and time, and then that BB will meld into the surrounding metal. So I don't know if you can get that on film, but yeah. Okay. Now, doing a repair on the edge right here is a bit different than doing that repair up there. We knew from our stir stick that our gap right here wasn't right, but it's a bit difficult to see like 1/16 of an inch or what have you. So we wanted to make sure, was it the fender that wasn't straight or the door that wasn't straight? So I put a straight edge up against the fender, it was straight. I put a straight edge up against the door, and I can see I've got a gap right up in here. Now that makes sense because we had this big dent right here. When this big dent gets pulled out, a lot of times the metal is going to get pulled out this way too. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to go ahead and we're going to grind this edge down. A lot of times I'll take a magic marker and I'll mark the top and bottom where it looks like I need to go, and maybe go just a little bit further on that, because when you're grinding, you'll hit the peripheral edges of things, so you need a little buffer zone on those. So this is your old classic hard wheel. And they're okay, but they're a bit messy, and they're just not that great these days. So we've got newer advancements. This is a flap wheel right here. This is just sandpaper laid down like this. And this is really nice. It works really good, and it keeps your heat down. But the problem with using it in a section like this is because of the shape of it, it might put gouges in it like this. So what we're going to do when we're grinding anything off that has to be nice and flat and even is we'll use a grinder like this. And all this stuff's easy to pick up anywhere you go. So with you use a wheel like this, it keeps it nice and even when you're grinding generally. It makes it a little bit easier for you. Now this you can use if you are taking away metal or if you're adding metal, because sometimes when you get a dent, it'll suck in and it'll leave you a gap and you'll have to add on to the metal. The main thing that you want to be careful of right here is that this is simply where the inner door and the outer door meet. So you got your inner door and you have your outer door just wrapped around it like that. And when you grind too much off, then the metal's just going to straight up split. And so if you grinded it too far and it split and it pulled the door out, now you have to work with all that too. If you're going to be grinding a lot off, only do a short section at a time so the whole thing doesn't come off on you. This isn't that bad. I'm just going to have to do a light grind and then go ahead and weld on the bead. And let me get to that point and I'll show you a couple of helpful handy tricks on that too. Now I know the camera's probably not going to pick it up, but right here it actually split the seam just in this one section, so not too bad. Now when I go ahead and weld, again, heat is your nemesis. You have to keep your heat down. It's really easy to warp this outside edge. So I'm going to do the same thing I did last time. I'll just get a tack weld in the middle and then about 3 or 4 inches down. And 3 or 4 inches up. So I've got to let these cool down, and then I'll just keep putting welds in between each individual weld. And I'll keep doing that until the gap gets really small between them. And then when I'm left with maybe a 1/4 of an inch or so, I'll just go zap, 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 and fill up that particular little gap. But you don't want to go all the way down. You don't want to over weld. Don't weld an inch and then just spot weld, cool down, grind down, spot weld, on and on until it's all done. So I'll just keep welding, grinding, cooling off, double checking with a straight edge until this is all done. But I'm not going to do that on camera because it's just too much time. Same thing goes with this guy right here. And these are basically the two main things that you'd be doing, either splitting the seam or adding on or subtracting to the edge of a door. Now you might ask yourself, well Dave, why didn't you add onto the door right here? Because normally I don't like to add onto the door if I don't have to. When you weld the edge on, then it can make that edge a little bit more weaker than the rest. If it catches on your key, your belt buckle, it makes it more susceptible. And you'll also have to do some body work on those, fill in any pits and things like that that might happen. So I like to move the body if as much as possible if it is the body that needs to be moved. And this truck really isn't that bad. It's in pretty good shape. So I'm going to go over a couple of things that this truck doesn't have a problem with, but you might, and you might need to fix. Now on this, it does have, this is tucking in just a little bit, but sometimes this entire piece right here, it can be bowed in or bowed out for miscellaneous reason, accident, made wrong from the factory, etc., etc. Now I wouldn't start to try to bend any of this piece until you make sure that everything is perfect, because you might have your door tucked in too far at the bottom and it's making your top poke out. You might have your top of your door pushed in too much and it's going too far in. So you only want to do this kind of mean work of bending and cutting and welding after you're absolutely sure what's wrong and how to fix it. But when I get something like that, I can just get a little piece of wood right here and put it right in there, and then just simply shut the door nice and gentle like, take it back out, and just keep trial fitting it until it looks right. I could also take a hammer and hit that in that particular spot, but if it was something like this, I wouldn't be able to. If this was bowed out, I'd simply grab the door here and try to push it in. If it was in too far, I would take the block of wood and probably put it on this whole back edge right here and then shut the door and double check. Another thing that I run into on a regular consistent basis is the rocker panels down here. A lot of times when they were done at the factory, delivery, they were done quick and hastily, and they were either tucked in too far or they were out too far. Maybe somebody's done a rocker repair on there and they didn't do it quite right. Sometimes I have to split that entire seam and move it in or out to get it correct. Sometimes the truck's been in an accident and these lines are just too close together. If you got smashed in the back or the front and now this is all squished, so I have to get a porter power and put some blocks of woods in here and go ahead and porter power it out and stretch it out and things like that. Sometimes it might be the other way and I have to make a bracket that holds onto the hinge bolts and actually shrink the door in. More than likely you're not going to run into those kind of problems, but be prepared if you do, because it does take some time on this. It is a bit frustrating, but I'm pretty confident you can do it, because if you took your truck apart this much, you'll be able to put it back together again with my help. My name is David Welch. I'm at Brothers Tech Center every single week, making sure your truck gets back on the road and looks good too. You make sure you check us out on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Ring the bell or whatever else there is to do while you're there, because I'm going to be back next Tuesday. You're not going to want to miss that video either. We'll see you all then.